Good morning. So yes, I will acknowledge I was one of the planes on the tally earlier. But with that, I was invited to come talk about the climate change influences on irrigation supply. And even when I came to the airport, it's very clear that agriculture is a very important part of this community, because you go into the airport and they have the beautiful mural at the baggage claim that I spent some time looking at, but it just shows how proud, and driving through the area, you can definitely see the support for it. So I've been working for reclamation for over 15 years, and during that time I've had a lot of opportunity to work throughout the Pacific Northwest, and especially here in the Rogue Basin. So I will just say I'm really impressed at the turnout here today, yet I'm not that surprised, because one of the first, if not the first, climate change specific report that reclamation referenced in a publication was from this area. It was Preparing for Climate Change in the Rogue River Basin of Southwest Oregon, and that was done in 2008. So while it was just a short 7 years ago, in the federal government, climate change wasn't a really popular term. And so with that, a lot has changed during that time. And so with that, many federal agencies and departments have been asked to embrace climate change as a reality. And specifically for reclamation, we're actually directed to address climate change on how it affects our mission. So the mission of reclamation is to manage, develop, and protect water and related resources in an environmentally and economically sound manner in the interest of the American public. If you've noticed, it doesn't say irrigation in there. However, what we do is we look at irrigation as well as many other components. Reclamation is the largest water manager in the West, as well as the second largest hydropower producer in the country. So the reason I'm going to show this is because I've had a lot of questions about where the Rogue River Basin and the Klamath Basin, how we're divvied up among reclamation. So reclamation only covers the 17 western states. It was founded to provide water for the arid West, primarily for agricultural purposes. So if you look, we have 5 regions, and so in there you can see where, I don't have the pointer, but where this basin is. Well, that little bump up that goes into Oregon, that's the Klamath Basin, and that's covered by our Mid-Pacific region. So I bring that up because that'll get up later in the conversation about how some other considerations that we have to look at as we talk about climate change impacts to irrigation. So with that, the one thing to note, because I'll talk about this throughout, is reclamation does not have a single organic act. What that means is we have to get authority from Congress to take any action. And so we have a few general actions, the authorities that allow us to do work, but we have hundreds of project-specific actions. So that brings us to how reclamation is directed to address climate change. So in 2009, the Public Law 11111 was passed. That's an omnibus bill. And in that, there was a section about the Secure Water Act. And in that section, it directed not just reclamation, but also USGS to work together to determine how we can identify climate impacts and how we can come up with solutions to those impacts. That was further supported by the secretarial order from the department to say, yes, you will work together. And not only that, but it's to start working among a lot of other federal agencies. And then finally, in 2013, the administration came down and said, yes, we need to be prepared for climate change. So that tells us that we can work on climate change. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of take a step back and step back in time and talk about irrigation in the Rogue Basin, because this definitely ties in. So the first irrigated land that I had record of is in 1852. So that was quite a long time ago. So the first dam was constructed in the early 1900s, and Talent Irrigation District was organized in 1916. So at that time, in the mid-1800s all the way through, irrigation development was going strong within this area. Hyatt Prairie Dam, now it's just called Hyatt Dam, was constructed in 1922 to 23. Immigrant Dam was finished in 24. That's a picture of Immigrant Dam, the first Immigrant Dam being constructed. But what happened in 1924 and a couple of years subsequent to that is the need for additional water supply and better flood control. And so while I'll talk today about climate change, this is a really common theme that we hear today more than 90 years later. I mean, almost 100 years later, we're still talking about the need for a reliable and sustainable water supply and the need to address any major impacts from storms and floods. So here comes reclamation. In 1927, we started doing a lot of studies, and in 1954, the Rogue River Basin Talent Division project was authorized by Congress, initially to provide water for irrigation, to generate power, and provide flood control and other beneficial uses. And then in 1962, it was amended to include fish and wildlife and recreation. So again, I mentioned how we have to have specific authority to actually do stuff. And so that's not only to do stuff, but spend taxpayer dollars on making sure that we're doing things in the best interest of the public. So that last one down there, I just put up there because I didn't want to forget about Medford Irrigation District or Rogue River Valley Irrigation District, but that gave them the assistance from us to help them improve their irrigation facilities. So here's a picture of what Immigrant looked like before it was reconstructed. This was in 1950. And then here is what it looks like now. So actually the elevation of the dam increased quite a bit. So this takes us to the impacts. These are the general climate impacts to irrigation supply. And so when we talk about impacts from an irrigation perspective on how climate change impacts, we look at two things primarily. It's water supply and infrastructure. And so I appreciate all of the prior speakers. I felt like they just set me right up for this to talk about. But one of the things, so there are several things that we look at, and these have been some of the general conclusions we've developed as an agency over the last several years. So we know that the form of precipitation is going to change. And what does that mean? Well, it's going to be going from rain or snow to rain. This is a big deal. So I'm going to use examples that we've had throughout the Pacific Northwest. So the Yakima Basin is one basin that I've worked in quite a bit. They have 5 reservoirs, and they call their snowpack the 6th reservoir. Well, this year they had a really poor snow year. And so now all of a sudden they had a huge challenge. So their junior water users only got 47% of their water. That's a big deal. So when we think about the form of precipitation, we need to be able to find ways to have a reliable water that capture, if you will, that rainwater. Changes the timing of snowmelt and stream flow. When it rains earlier or the snowmelt comes off earlier, again, need to be able to capture that. One of the things I mentioned earlier was flood control. This gets into some of the other considerations we have to do because we have flood control rule curves that were set by another agency that we have to follow. Well, with the shifting of timing, we have to kind of manage that as well as our operations for irrigation. So some other complications. But stream flow. Well, if it rains and it snows and everything happens earlier, the lower the stream flow later in the season. And that's a big deal because one of the other things is longer growing season. Well, if you have a longer growing season, you still need water to provide for the crops. And if you have lower stream flows and less water supply, unfortunately, it's a negative impact. However, there are ways that we have, there are solutions to those, but again, because again, the amount of precipitation, as you've seen throughout this morning, seems to be relatively constant. Okay, so one of the examples I was going to use is in the eastern part of Oregon, in the Owyhee area. They had to shut their irrigation off this year in mid-July because there was no snow melt for the last couple years and the reservoirs weren't filling. And so that was one of the big challenges in Eastern Oregon this year. So the longer growing season, I talked about that again, but one of the other things too is, and I appreciate the prior speaker, was the impact of disease for plants. One of the things that we talk about is wetter, warmer springs get a lot of mold in some of the crops. Okay, so then I'm going to jump down to the infrastructure. So impacts for infrastructure on the irrigation supply. Invasive species are a big deal. So we'll talk about that in two different ways. So we have the like bugs, and actually one of the big things that, as many of you probably know, quagga mussels. Quagga mussels are hugely problematic to our infrastructure because once they get into a system, they will literally coat anything underwater. And so what it does is it makes the operations of the actual facility really hard until those, literally are scraped off, and they multiply so rapidly. So it causes a lot of problems for irrigation supplies. I don't know about, I know the Pacific Northwest has been very proactive in the spread of the quagga mussels, but I've seen what it has done to our other facilities, and it's actually rather stunning to see how rapidly they propagate and can make a big impact on infrastructure. So then the other thing too on specific to infrastructure is fire, storms, increased intensity and frequency of storms, as well as fire. So the storms, they come in, and I'm not, because I'm not from here, but in Boise, I've lived there my whole life, we're seeing monsoons. This summer we had a storm event that lasted a half an hour and we got 2 inches of rain. We live in a desert. How does that happen? But these are the kind of things, and so one thing that we noticed, even though it wasn't irrigation related, our public work facility is not designed to handle that amount of precipitation. So the same goes for irrigation as well, is making sure that reservoirs have the capacity, even some of the laterals, the canals, that have the capacity to move water around if it's necessary. And fire. Fire is a big thing for irrigation. It may not seem kind of corollary, but again, we've had situations where we've had fires around our facilities. Fortunately, we haven't lost any structures, but what it has done to the landscape around it, it has burned all the vegetation. So then we'll have these big storms, and it just causes the landslides. So then we end up with a lot of material farther downstream. Our irrigation districts have challenges moving the debris out of the way, because it's not a little bit, it's typically logs and a lot of vegetation that has been burned. So, and then sedimentation becomes an issue as well. So when we talk about the climate change impacts, it's water and infrastructure, then we have the piece in there that covers both. So we have a decrease in water supply, or water quality, excuse me. Decrease in water quality. So we've talked about the higher temperatures. I've heard talk about sedimentation. And so one of the things that we talk about in terms of water quality is, so there is an expectation as a reservoir sitting there, it literally it becomes a heat sink, so it starts heating up. So that makes the temperatures downstream, it can be hot, it can be warmer. But then we have the increased use of pesticides and herbicides, so that because of the climate change. So that starts to decrease the water quality. And then you have sedimentation as well when you have these fires or these storm events. So all of these things start to culminate, and so you have just poor water quality in general. And then the increased frequency and severity of droughts. That is something that all over our agency, we have a lot of concern for. Being prepared in advance of the drought has been one of the things, and one of the initiatives that our agency undertook. So we provided some funding to our partners to start planning for droughts, to take a look at, be prepared, we call it contingency planning, because you may not always have a drought. But then again, you may need to have some things ready to go, actions on the shelf, if you will, that when that time comes, be prepared to act. And those two cover both the water supply as well as the infrastructure. Okay, so these are my only graphs, I promise. So how did we come to these general conclusions? So we used available information. So Reclamation has analyzed historical data, and I just put this temperature and precipitation. This is the Columbia River. It's very similar to what you've already seen today. On the left, the temperature, it's trending up. Precipitation, staying relatively constant. We use that historical data, and we use climate change models and research. We have been developing our own technical expertise on climate change modeling, where we take that historical data, stream flow, temperatures, and we project them out into the future to come up with scenarios to see what's most likely going to happen in the future. We also have our science and technology program, where they're developing some tools so that we can use to address some of these issues that we've been talking about today. And then what happens is that information all gets compiled into assessment reports. So we've done several different type of assessments, starting at what I like to say the 30,000-foot level that goes all the way down to the 300-foot level. So the 30,000-foot level are our climate impact assessments. That was prescribed to us through the Secure Water Act, that Reclamation shall look at the 8 major river basins in the western United States and see what the impacts are. And then from there, we step down to basin studies. So we've conducted about 5 basin studies within the Pacific Northwest region. Currently, we're doing one in the Upper Deschutes Basin. We partner with local entities where we bring people together and collaborate to come up with, look at what the water supply is now, what it's going to look like in the future, what are some solutions that we can come up with, and do some trade-off analysis. Because everybody knows that building a new dam is not that popular, because for lots of reasons, but sometimes those are the options that are put on the table. But we do a trade-off. What does a new dam do? There's some major environmental impacts, land impacts, water supplies, water rights, who gets the new water? So we bring up all of these solutions, and then what we do is we give it to the partners, and then they start implementing on the local level. So here's Rogue River Basin. This is the schematic of the irrigation system in this valley that Reclamation works with. So our managing partner, if you will, is Talent Irrigation District. We transfer our facility to them to operate and maintain, but we also work with Medford and Rogue River Valley Irrigation Districts as well. The reason I bring this up is because this brings in some of the challenges that you may face, or that we all face, is along that the difference between the Klamath side and the Rogue side, because there's trans-basin diversions that occur. So water goes from the Rogue to the Klamath and back to the Rogue. There's a little bit that comes back over, a little bit from the Klamath, but it comes back and forth. Systems, it looks complicated sometimes, depending on the year, it actually really is. But I give them a lot of credit for managing these 3 pools of water in a way that is going to provide that sustainable water supply for the local area. One of the things that you've probably all very familiar with are the issues in the Klamath Basin. And so these are major consideration. From our region, and I showed you that map, that little bump where we have 2 different regions, we try to work together, but really stick to our authorities. So we protect, and in the Pacific Northwest region, we really focus in that we have the Rogue River Basin Project. This is how it operates, and that's been dictated to us by Congress. So when it gets to the Klamath side, they have to stick to what they are authorized for in that project. So that's some good, but not always. So that's how the irrigation works in this area. So I talked about other impacts to consider. So while I focused on irrigation supplies, there are a lot of things that Reclamation has to work on, which is the environmental component. We have flood control. The other thing to consider is looking at the capacity and capability of the entire system. So I showed you that schematic. It's pretty complicated. Yeah, we could say, well, if you raise the pool of one reservoir, what does it do to something else? So there's always going to be some adjustments that have to be made for the entire system to work properly. Flood control. I talked about some of our rule curves with the timing of water coming sooner, typically what that means is in order for public safety, water has to be released out of the reservoirs in order to minimize any impact of flood. Do those need to be addressed probably in the future? Absolutely, given these shift in timings. Fish and wildlife species. As reservoirs go down for the terrestrial as well as other aquatic species, what does that mean? We have flows that are required for ESA listed species. Recreation, there's impacts to recreations. And the one that's definitely most challenging is water rights. Who gets the water first? If there's new supplies, how does that get divvied up? So that's typically where I'll let another legal group take care of that one. So I'm just going to make one small advertisement. So I mentioned that we do a lot with climate change. Our Water Smart program, this is where we develop and we have that authority to work through and give partners support. So we work through our grants program. We have water and energy efficiency grants. The Title 16 program is not used much in the Pacific Northwest, but that's a recycle and reuse program that's used a lot in the southwestern United States. Our Basin Study program, that's one where we encourage partners to come together and we come up with solutions on how to address water supply and with climate change impacts. We have the Cooperative Watershed Management Program, where we encourage a lot of local groups to come together themselves. And then our newest one, our Drought Response Program. So you can find more information. I put the website, I don't know if you can see that, but it's www.usbr.gov/watersmart. And with that, thank you for letting me come.